Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this Juneteenth conversation with the esteemed Dr. Walter Rucker, a professor here at Emory University in the Department of African American Studies. Um, he has graciously allowed us to take some time away from his very busy schedule, which is why we're doing a Juneteenth conversation this week, because our faculty are so busy and their excellence in their field puts them in demand. So I so appreciate you, Dr. Rucker, giving us this time this afternoon to have this conversation about the importance of Juneteenth. Even though we know our institution, which I was pleased about, recognized it this year for the first time, giving people time to reflect on that. We also need to kind of connect it to what Juneteenth symbolizes and why this liberation time is important. So that's what our conversation is going to be about this afternoon. So welcome, Dr. Rucker.
And thank you so much, Dr. Henderson, for the very warm welcome. And I look forward to this conversation because, as you know, our nation is at an inflection point when it comes to issues regarding the past, regarding racial violence, regarding our racial present. So having these kinds of conversations are, I think, useful and providing a pathway forward in this national conversation about race.
Yes, wonderful. So let's go ahead and get into the first question, which is, and I should let everyone know, this conversation is being recorded. So if you have colleagues who can't make this particular time, we will let you know when that will be available for viewing. And this conversation will be 30 minutes. And so that we can get what we can, the nuggets of wisdom during that time. So the first question will be, given the scope of your work, Dr. Rucker, and Juneteenth, can you tell us about where Juneteenth fits in the space of your work? For those that don't know, Dr. Rucker's expertise is in slavery and slave resistance. And so that's what that question is about. Where does Juneteenth fit within that space?
So in many ways, Juneteenth is a logical bookend to my work on slave resistance. So it's the moment where African Americans experienced that liberatory reality. They were freed. And leading up to that moment, the kind of work that I do on slave resistance, I demonstrate that through a variety of acts, including embedding political discourse in things like folklore or things like celebrations, that enslaved African Americans and free Blacks express their opposition to slavery as an evil system. Now, we often think about resistance as a major revolt, or conspiracy like Gabriel Prosser, right?
Yes.
And there are only a handful of those throughout the course of United States history or North American history. But resistance could be things as everyday or quotidian as someone, burning a plantation building or poisoning the food of the master and mistress, or placing crushed glass in the food of the white household, engaging in work slowdowns, for example, leaving the plantation either temporarily or permanently. So there are a variety of ways in which resistance was manifested. And there are also what I call like culturally encoded or culturally embedded, where African Americans developed what I call cultural technologies. That is, they used what they had access to and embedded what they had access to with political discourse. So Mardi Gras or Brer Rabbit, at the core of either this celebration that was pre-Lenten and Catholic that was taken over by Black people in New Orleans, or at the core of Brer Rabbit tales, which seem innocuous and innocent, there was a political discourse of discontent with slavery and a moral judgment about slavery and the attitudes and behaviors of white elites. So Juneteenth, in many ways, again, is a bookend, but it also captures some of that long-standing cultural tradition of embedding discourse within acts of public processions, parades, and celebrations. The story, I'm sure you know, June 19th, 1865, in Galveston, Texas, Union troops come This is about 2 months after the end of the Civil War, after the South has surrendered. And they announced to the enslaved African American men and women there that they were free based on the Emancipation Proclamation. And so what started was an instantaneous celebration of liberty. They had reached sort of their promised land finally. Now, I should say there's some paradox here because the Emancipation Proclamation, as a document upon which their freedom was based, when Abraham Lincoln offered that to the public, he did not free any of the 400 some odd thousand enslaved peoples in the border states. So there was still slavery in the border states through December of 1865, after Juneteenth. So the people he had direct access over, the people he had direct access to, he did not free them. And it tells us a lot about Lincoln and his thinking as the war progressed up until the writing of the Emancipation Proclamation. So what began as a Texas-based local celebration began to spread over the next few decades to neighboring states, Louisiana, to Oklahoma, to Kansas and Nebraska and the Great Plains. By the 1930s and 40s, it's in the Midwest, it's on the West Coast. And by the 1970s, it's a national celebration among African Americans of what they consider to be their true independent state.
And it's interesting to have this celebration occur June 19th, and we know we're coming up on this, we're marking July 4th.
Yes.
That this independent, and whose independence, whose celebration is really July 4th. I keep, while you were speaking, I kept thinking of Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," which is a brilliant, I think, written document, but spoken document about hypocrisy and about the paradox of what freedom looks like for people of African ancestry, and particularly those that were in bondage. I mean, because I know when we teach, there are some who weren't in bondage, but for primarily the markings of those individuals, we were. And the other question I would ask is this idea of resistance. So I consider Douglass's written piece a piece of resistance at that particular time. But what do you think about people of African ancestry have always been part of their own liberation, their own freedom. And so resistance, what are we really resistant to? Yeah.
Well, because I'm a scholar, not just of North American slavery, but also Black Atlantic slavery, I can talk very broadly about this and then bring it back to the United States and that experience. But very often their resistance was resistance to white supremacy, white control. And how that manifested would be looking at their goals. So when you think about, for example, the Haitian Revolution, and I'm not talking about the Creole leadership at the top, but the people who call themselves the Congos, the people who were enslaved during the course of the revolution, their actions, right? They burned cane fields, they destroyed sugar mills, they destroyed the architecture and the edifice of slavery. And their post-slave state, what they saw as their ideal was being yeoman farmers, having their own land, growing their own crops that were not slave crops, not sugar or cotton, not tobacco, but crops they can eat and subsist off and be completely independent from white society. You find this kind of notion throughout the Black Atlantic, and you find it in the United States. So one of the things that happened during the course of the Civil War in Port Royal, South Carolina, 1862, right? Union troops have come to this area, liberated enslaved peoples, and given them land. And one of the things that begins to happen internally is a dialogue about, do we want to grow slave crops? Or do we want to have an independent existence away from white society, away from the market economy, away from oppression? So there's this tension that you see that articulates this public and political discourse across the Black Atlantic. They want sovereignty more than anything else. And sovereignty meant we don't want to be slaves to a market economy that's going to force us to grow cotton, tobacco, or sugar for international exchange. We want to grow food. We want to have our own communities. We want to survive. And one of the failures of W.E.B. Du Bois, the brilliant sociologist, historian, scholar, activist, in his 1935 treatment, Black Reconstruction, says, if they had been given land, maybe sharecropping wouldn't have happened. Maybe debt peonage wouldn't have happened. And even some of the radical Republicans in Congress in the aftermath of the Civil War said, Thaddeus Stevens said, when he came up with the 40 acres and a mule, if we do not give them land forfeited from rebel properties, we had best leave them as slaves. That's what they'll be reverted to. And so for me, I'm going to expand this back to Juneteenth. One of the reasons why I've made a personal decision not to celebrate July 4th, but to celebrate and venerate Juneteenth. For African Americans who know their slave ancestry, who know their genealogy, who know what their ancestors were doing July 4th, 1776, for me to celebrate that holiday with all the paradox and all the contradiction that's involved in it, it would be the equivalent of me kicking dirt in the face of my ancestors. Because what I'm celebrating in effect is 3 additional decades of slavery. What do I mean by that?
Wow.
British Empire, through an act on August 1st, 1834, ended slavery in their American colonies. Okay? So had maybe the United States never been created, had there still been British control over the US, my ancestors may have been freed in 1834 and not 1865. That's 30 additional years of short lifespans, of a devastating disease ecology, of rape, mutilation, dismemberment, of high infant mortality, of all these terrible things that show that Black lives didn't matter in that era. Celebrating July 4th celebrates more of that. So as a personal decision, I don't celebrate July 4th, in part because of what Fred Douglass said. That's a brilliant speech, right? He was asked by white abolitionists to talk about what's the meaning of July 4th to the slave. And you, as a scholar, as a brilliant scholar of literature, you know, he opened a speech by criticizing the white abolitionists. How dare you bring me to ask about this? It means nothing to me. How can we celebrate this nation's birth when that birth meant more slavery for my people? Yeah. So he admonishes throughout most of that speech the white abolitionists who brought him in to talk about July 4th and its meaning. So that's the speech I think about this time of the year between Juneteenth and July 4th, and why, again, a personal choice, I choose to celebrate one and not the other.
Yeah, I think you bring up a wonderful point about as when we think of resistance, even in that moment, what we choose to celebrate, the freedom to do that is based on the legacy of a history that we have to wrestle with on a daily basis. Some of us wrestle with on a daily basis. And that is when we think of liberation and we think of freedom and resistance, it is in that legacy that we consider that. Thank you for that. So I'm gonna, Brian Stevenson, I wanna turn to Brian Stevenson. So he gave this wonderful commencement speech where he admonishes in some ways us as scholars, as thinkers, and the class of 2020 to say, in order to make our society more just, more equitable, more free in some ways, we need to, and I took away 2 of these things. He said, in order to uproot systemic racism and social injustice, we must get proximate and we must change the narrative. So there's 3 things among the other brilliant things he said, was we must get proximate, we must change the narrative and do uncomfortable things in the service of justice. In reflecting on our current moment, this is my question, and the increased attention to Juneteenth, where do you place Stevenson's observations, or how can they serve as a roadmap for us to go forward when I think of healing, reconciliation, truth sharing, education, and awareness about America's complex, brutal history in order for us to make his ideals and many of ours that we live in a just society a realization?
Thank you. That's a great question. And that was a great commencement address as well. And a very powerful one, and of course, timely one, given where we are now, this point of inflection in American history. I would first say, one of the prerequisites to getting proximate is to match words with deeds.
Yes.
And one of the things I know in American history, sadly, is that we have never reached a point where there could be reconciliation because we haven't had those uncomfortable conversations yet. I mean by that. So when you think about what happened in the aftermath of South African apartheid, okay, they very painfully went through a series of trials where they told those who were accused of killing people in custody, you won't be charged. What we want to know is what happened. We want to know what happened to these family members, to these activists who disappeared in your custody. There was a national reckoning and a national conversation with the most uncomfortable topics of racial violence, of brutality, of death, and assassinations. But you know what emerged out of that was a sense that they have made a decided step towards reconciling those savage divides between the white minority and the Black majority in Southern Africa. We have never had a national conversation in this country. Civil war ends, slavery ends, and there's an immediate rush to reconcile differences between the white North and the white South. Redemption is what it's called. And under this guise of white redemption or white supremacy and white reconciliation, the foundation of that was white America collectively put their foot on the back of Black people. We were the sacrificial lambs in that reconciliation process. We weren't part of the reconciliation. We weren't part of a larger set of conversations. So matching word with deeds means reconciling with the past, means not just acknowledging and regretting the past, but you know what? An apology is actually important.
Yes.
A heartfelt, full-throated, sincere apology before moving forward. And I know, like recently, one of my former employers, UNC Chapel Hill, Carol Folt, before she stepped down and left for another president position, gave a very heartfelt apology for UNC's role in slavery. Wake Forest, the president there, very recently, also very clear, very full-throated apology for that institution's link to slavery. I mean, heck, the US Congress apologized for slavery. A joint resolution in 2010 apologized for slavery, but then also they put a disclaimer that this does not mean you can sue the United States for its past connections to slave trade, slavery, or Jim Crow.
Yeah, that would be bankruptcy right there. Yeah, that would be bankruptcy.
But various institutions have apologized, have offered heartfelt apologies. I think that's the first step towards reconciliation. It can't be a very lawyerly regret or a lawyerly acknowledgement. It has to be, we understand the role that this institution played and the benefits it accrued from slavery, and we apologize for that.
Yes, and you know that I'm thinking too, and thank you for that. When we think, it seems like a simple thing, but apology also acknowledges the humanity of the other. So, when I'm thinking of, I keep thinking of a Toni Morrison, that wonderful scholar who has gone to be with the ancestors, and her belief that America has to, and I think even Brian Stevenson believes this as well, we have no monuments to slavery.
Right.
We have monuments to those who had a particular belief about that, which I think when I'm thinking about a current moment, and this would be kind of a follow-up question, when I think of the current moment we're in, and I'm seeing a lot of things be dismantled behind the energy of the movement for the recognition of Black humanity, that Black Lives Matter, that it is not okay to suffocate a person for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That is not okay. And in essence, to force us to watch a murder This idea of an acknowledgement, the tension that I see right now of things being dismantled. What are your reflections on that? Because I'm seeing things like Uncle Ben disappearing, Aunt Jemima disappearing, there are monuments being taken down. We see what happened with NASCAR, with the Confederate flag not being shown there. How do you, and Juneteenth just happens to be in this moment. It's folded into this moment. What do you do with that? How do you texturize that conversation?
Well, I know some people will sort of not understand the importance of symbols and the reason why symbols need to be rearticulated or deconstructed or destroyed. I grew up in Atlanta. My home school would have been Gordon High. Another school in my area was Walker High. Two high schools in a Black area of this city named after Confederate generals. Gordon High's mascot was a Yosemite Sam character with 2 6-shooters that shot out Confederate flags at a Black high school. So this whole discussion about changing the symbols, changing hurtful meanings, or destroying hurtful meanings has been long-standing. I mean, Gordon High changed to McNair after Ron McNair, the Black astronaut, back in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yes.
When Black people in that community said, enough is enough, these Confederate symbols that surround us at all times.
Yes.
Seeing Confederate flags, even around Emory's campus, there are Confederate flags, houses that wave Confederate flags. They hurt. As an historian, I've never understood this whole narrative that this is about heritage. My heritage matters too. I'm from the South. I'm a Southerner. My maternal line came from Central Georgia on a plantation owned by James P. Redding. I can trace that line back to the 1740s, and a Confederate flag means a continuation of all that pain in my family's history.
Wow.
So as long as people cannot see the pain that symbols cause, it's hard to have that reconciliation and that honest conversation. One of the things that happened in the aftermath of the Nazi atrocities in Germany, the state of Germany, banned Nazi symbols. It is against the law to openly display a Nazi symbol. That's not about changing or forgetting about the history. It's about making sure that those ugly things do not continue into the present and future. So I know there's a lot of discourse in the South. Oftentimes people say, well, it's about heritage. But what is completely being omitted from that discussion is that there are a lot of Black folk in the South, 40% of the Southern population in some states. What about our heritage? What about the meaning these symbols have for us and how hurtful that legacy is for us? So part of reconciliation is recognizing, that kind of pain and that kind of hurt. Now, Emory, I will say, in 2011, my predecessor, brilliant scholar Leslie Harris, spearheaded an effort to study the history of slavery at Emory and maybe change the whole narrative about sort of Emory's role in that ugly history. That was a very important conference because it started a movement. So from 2011, that inaugural conference on slavery in the university, through 2019, there were annual conferences about universities studying slavery, right? Out of this project have come a number of things like monuments on various campuses, discussions at various campuses, a fellowship at Georgetown where the descendants of those who had been sold by Georgetown would receive scholarships from that point forward. So out of that set of conferences came a consortium, a 60-member consortium of universities like Brown and Columbia, UVA and others, called the University Studying Slavery Consortium. Emory should have been the inaugural member of that consortium. The first conference happened on this campus. Emory to this day is not a member of that consortium. So even Emory has a role to play in facilitating discussions about its past and facilitating discussions about reconciliation. And I'll give you just one quick example. I know we're running out of time.
Okay, sure.
What can happen when a university puts its resources into reconciliation? So I was at Rutgers University in New Jersey most recently, And they commissioned a group led by Deborah Gray White, Marissa Fuentes, Cami Townsend, and Paul Clemens called Scarlet and Black. It was a study of dispossession of Native Americans and the enslavement of Africans in Rutgers history.
Yes, it's wonderful. I've seen that on the website. Mm-hmm.
They have 2 volumes. They have 2 edited volumes. They have a website. But very importantly, with a team of undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty, they uncovered the fact that Sojourner Truth, her mother and father, were owned by the founding president of Rutgers.
Really?
And what the university did, they renamed an entire section of the campus the Sojourner Truth Commons. They built the freshman apartments. The freshman apartments are called the Sojourner Truth Apartments. And I remember when, there was a dedication ceremony in the following year, the first freshman class to inhabit the Sojourner Truth apartments were coming in and moving in. And there was an African-American young woman, her family, they were moving in, and the campus newspaper interviewed her and asked her, "What does this mean to you?" And she said, with a huge smile on her face, because this is a video on the website for the newspaper, "I am so proud to be here." Mm-hmm. I would love for students at Emory to say that. Yeah. For African-American students to be able to say, "I am so proud at what this university did," mm-hmm. To honor the past. And Juneteenth is a step, but having Juneteenth without that full reckoning is empty.
Yeah, I thank you for that. And I can, as we close this out, this has been fabulous. Thank you so much, Dr. Rucker, for sharing with us, for being so transparent and open about how scholarship. So one of the things that I love about this conversation is how the scholarship informs what we do and what we put into practice and how we live and how we interrelate. And so I can tell you, I looked into the consortium, and that is something we will discuss. And so I can tell you out of our office, I've been looking into that. So we will begin to build bridges of access to see where we can be with that. I know that there's the 10-year coming up, decade having hosted the original conference. So that might be something to consider in the future, but that is definitely on our radar. And I can tell you that there is conversation about acknowledging, those that are captive. I always struggle with that word slave. You hear me go, zzz, because people were not, they were born into slavery, right. but it's that how important that language, we will use that not free, the individuals who were not free, or they were in bondage, or they were captive, so that people understand the free will of us.
Yes.
And those who have that history are the descendants of those. But that we are looking at that and looking at Oxford College and all of that. So stay tuned, Emory. Stay tuned on what we're going to do. I think that was one of the important things about Juneteenth, so that we can have that dialogue and resurface this. And we have new people in place who can help revitalize that conversation. And I look forward to being a part of that dialogue, so that we can have students say, "I'm proud to be at Emory." And this is it in my other conversation with the Reverend Dr. Gregory Ellison II, we talked about fearless dialogues. And so being fearless means we have to, see, which means acknowledge what that is, acknowledge the pain and hurt of others, acknowledge what we have to balance daily, and then hear what people are really saying, which is this moment of clarity here. And then that third step, Dr. Ellison encourages people to do is change. So hopefully this conversation will be the stepping stone to more change and more truth-telling and sharing, and move us onto a road of healing, so that we can get to what that restorative reconciliation mode. So thank you. Thank you. I don't know if you have any words of wisdom you'd like to leave everyone. I always like to ask that, because we have students, alumni, community members who are trying to put this moment in perspective. And so I want to give you that moment here.
Well, I do want to say, though I have been, critical of certain things that certain institutions have done, I do see more of an interest to match words with deeds. In fact, in many ways, your office, your presence on this campus is part of a larger commitment to diversity and inclusion that Emory has embraced. So I do appreciate that. But there are other areas, other ways that we can, further match words with deeds and further sort of facilitate reconciliation.
Yes, and we need to. I mean, that's growth. And so my words of wisdom with everyone is to keep the faith. I mean, we're at this moment now, this reflective moment, and we're at a moment where we can't sit. And we're at a moment where we can't be passive. And we're at a moment where we may be exhausted and tired, but we need to pause and then regather ourselves to continue that journey, because Dr. Rucker and I, just as Reverend Dr. Ellison said, are the manifestation of the dreams of our ancestors. So your presence back at Emory, when you have family who were part of enslavement in 17, this is an amazing kind of juxtaposition of living history. And so I will say thank you. I know your ancestors are singing and very proud of what you offer, not only to the studies in African American studies, but to higher education writ large, because our presence means that those conversations will continue, and that voices that sometimes are silenced in academic spaces have now been given the room to be heard. And so thank you so much. And we thank everyone who's tuned in, and hope that this experience was one that will encourage you to continue to find that something that you can do to continue to cultivate an environment here of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Have a fabulous, fabulous rest of the week.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Henderson.
you. Take care.
Take care.